Your memory is not broken. It was never broken. It was just never properly trained, and that single truth, that one quiet realization, has the power to completely change the way you think, the way you learn, and the way you live your entire life. There is a man, let's call him Daniel, who spent years convinced he simply had a bad memory. He forgot names the moment he heard them. He walked into rooms and stood there completely blank, wondering what he had come for. He studied for exams only to feel the information dissolve the second the paper was placed in front of him. He blamed his genes. He blamed his age. He blamed stress. Poor sleep, too much coffee, not enough coffee. He tried everything the world told him to try, and none of it worked. Not permanently. Not in any real, lasting way. Then one afternoon, digging through an old box of his grandfather's books, he found a small, worn volume. The pages were yellowed, the spine was cracked, and the title read simply, The Trained Memory by Warren Hilton. He almost set it aside. Something made him open it instead. What he found inside those pages was not a trick, not a shortcut, not a gimmick. What he found was a complete and thorough understanding of how his mind actually worked, and more importantly, how to work with it rather than against it. By the time he finished that book, Daniel was a different person. Not because some magic happened, but because he finally understood the mechanics of his own mind. He understood that memory is a skill, not a talent. He understood that forgetting is not a failure, it is a process, and that process can be redirected, reshaped, and retrained. That is exactly what we are going to explore here together, because Warren Hilton's The Trained Memory is one of the most thoughtful, thorough, and genuinely useful books ever written on the subject of human memory. Published in the early 20th century as part of his Applied Psychology series, it lays out a complete framework for understanding, developing, and mastering the memory in ways that feel, even today, remarkably modern and deeply practical. So settle in, because what follows is not just a summary of ideas. It is a journey through the architecture of your own mind, and by the end of it, you are going to see yourself and your potential very differently. Hilton opens his work with a premise that is both simple and startling. He says that every single person walking the earth has been given, by nature, a memory that is more than adequate for the demands of a successful life. The problem is not capacity, the problem is cultivation. Most people, he argues, use their memory the way someone might use a powerful tool they have never been taught to operate. They fumble with it, they misuse it, they get frustrated when it does not do what they want, and they conclude that the tool itself must be defective. It never occurs to them to learn how the tool actually works. And that is where Hilton begins. He begins with the biology, the psychology, and the philosophy of memory, not to overwhelm the reader, but to give the reader a foundation. Because you cannot train something you do not understand. You cannot improve a process you cannot see. And once you see memory for what it really is, once you understand its nature, its mechanics, its tendencies, you gain something very powerful. You gain leverage. The brain, Hilton explains, is not a passive container. It does not simply receive information the way a jar receives water. It is an active, living, dynamic organ that is constantly processing, filtering, connecting, and reorganizing everything that passes through the senses. Every experience you have, every sound you hear, every face you see, every word you read, leaves a trace in the nervous system, a physical trace, a groove, in a sense, cut into the living tissue of your brain by the flow of experience. This idea, which Hilton calls the formation of neural pathways, though he uses the language of his era to describe it, is central to everything that follows. Because if memories are physical traces, then the question becomes, what makes some traces deep and others shallow? What makes some memories vivid and others faint? What makes some information stick and other information vanish within minutes? The answer, Hilton tells us, comes down to three things: attention, association, and repetition. And he spends the heart of his book unpacking each one of these with a depth and clarity that is genuinely remarkable. Let us start with attention, because Hilton treats this as the master key. Without attention, nothing else is possible. Without genuine, focused, intentional attention, no real memory can be formed. And here is the part that so many people miss entirely. Most of what we call forgetting is not actually forgetting at all. Most of the time, the information was never properly recorded in the first place. It never made it deep enough into the mind to form a lasting trace. It grazed the surface and slid away because we were never truly present when it arrived. Think about the last time you were introduced to someone at a gathering. The handshake, the smile, the name spoken, and then, 3 minutes later, the name was completely gone. Did you forget it? Not exactly. You never really registered it. Your eyes were looking around the room, your mind was composing a sentence about yourself, your attention was anywhere but on that name. And so the name never had a chance. It arrived and found no one home. Hilton says this is the fundamental mistake, and it is almost entirely a habit, the habit of divided attention, the habit of being physically present while mentally elsewhere. And like all habits, it can be broken and replaced with something better. He asks the reader to consider what it actually feels like to pay genuine attention to something. Not the performance of attention, where you nod and make eye contact while thinking about dinner, but real attention, the kind where your mind leans in, the kind where the object of your focus becomes, for a moment, the only thing in the world. You have felt this. Everyone has. It happens when you are reading something that truly grips you, or listening to music that reaches inside you, or watching a sunset that stops your thoughts cold. In those moments, you remember everything. Every detail carves itself into you. And that, Hilton says, is not a special gift. That is simply what attention does when it is fully engaged. The trained memory begins, therefore, not with techniques or mnemonic devices, but with the decision to be present, to develop the habit of genuine, full engagement with whatever is before you, to meet each experience not with half a mind, but with a whole one. There is a story Hilton tells, in spirit if not in exact words, about a teacher who could remember the name of every student who had ever passed through his classroom, hundreds of them, over decades of teaching. When asked how he did it, the teacher said something that surprised people. He said he had never tried to memorize a single name in his life. What he did instead was something far simpler and far more powerful. When a student told him their name, he stopped. Completely. He looked at them. He thought about the name. He wondered about it. He connected it to something, the look of the person, a feeling, a colour, an image. He was present with that name for a few seconds, genuinely present, before he moved on. And those few seconds of real attention were worth more than hours of repetitive drilling. This is the first great lesson of the trained memory. Give your full attention, even briefly, and memory almost takes care of itself. But attention alone, while necessary, is not sufficient, because the mind does not store information in isolation. It stores it in relationship. Every new piece of information that enters your consciousness is immediately, automatically, and sometimes unconsciously being linked to things you already know. This is the nature of association, and it is the second pillar of everything Hilton teaches. The mind, he explains, is not a filing cabinet with separate drawers for separate facts. It is more like an enormous web, where every node is connected to dozens or hundreds of other nodes, and where pulling on one thread causes ripples across the entire structure. This is why the smell of something baking can suddenly pull you back to a kitchen from 30 years ago. This is why a phrase heard in passing can unlock a memory you had not thought of in years. The web vibrates and the connections activate. Understanding this changes everything about how you approach learning something new. Instead of trying to hold a fact in isolation, you ask yourself, Where does this belong in the web? What does it connect to? What does it remind me of? What does it feel like? What story does it fit into? Hilton gives us a wonderful illustration here, though, again, in the spirit of his work rather than a direct quotation. He describes two students studying the same historical date, the year of a particular battle. The first student reads the date, repeats it several times, moves on. The second student pauses. He thinks about what was happening in the world that year. He connects the date to the leader involved, to the country, to the cause, to the outcome. He builds a small web of meaning around that date, so that the date itself is no longer an isolated fact floating in mental space, but a node in a living network of related information. Ask both students a week later. The first student has, more often than not, lost the date entirely. The second student remembers it without effort because it is held in place by everything around it. This is the method Hilton calls associative learning, and it is not a trick. It is simply the way the brain was designed to work. The brain loves connection. It craves relationship between ideas. It remembers stories far better than lists. It remembers images far better than abstractions. It remembers feelings far better than facts stripped of all emotion. Which brings us to a crucial point that Hilton makes with real insistence throughout his book. Emotion is not the enemy of memory. Emotion is one of its greatest allies. Events charged with feeling, whether joy, fear, surprise, wonder, or love, are almost never forgotten. They are written into the nervous system with a force that makes them permanent. The challenge, he says, is to bring some degree of emotional engagement to things that initially seem dry or colourless, to find the human interest in the technical concept, to find the story inside the statistic, to find something that makes the material matter to you personally. And this is not as difficult as it might sound, because almost everything, when examined closely enough, contains something interesting. Almost every fact, when placed in its proper context, reveals a connection to human life, to human struggle, to human aspiration. The trained memory does not simply accept information as it comes. It works with that information. It turns it over. It looks for the angle of entry, the point at which the information becomes personally meaningful. There is something worth pausing on here, something that goes slightly beyond technique and touches something deeper. Hilton is quietly suggesting that the development of memory is also, in some sense, the development of curiosity, that the person who trains their memory becomes, almost inevitably, a more curious person, a more engaged person, someone who meets the world with a kind of active interest rather than passive reception. And that curiosity, in turn, makes memory easier, which deepens curiosity further. It is a beautiful upward cycle, and it begins with the simple decision to care more about what you are experiencing. Now we arrive at the third pillar, repetition, but not repetition in the way most people understand it. Not the grinding, monotonous, slightly desperate repetition of someone cramming before a deadline. Hilton has something far more intelligent and effective in mind. He distinguishes carefully between what we might call dead repetition and living repetition. Dead repetition is the act of going over the same material in the same way, passively, mechanically, without engagement. It produces some results, eventually, through sheer force, but it is inefficient and unpleasant, and the memories it creates are often brittle and context-dependent. They collapse under pressure. Living repetition is something entirely different. It is the act of returning to material actively, with slightly fresh eyes each time, finding new angles, making new connections, testing yourself, applying the information, teaching it to someone else, or simply thinking about it in idle moments. Living repetition works with the natural architecture of memory rather than against it. And there is a timing element here that Hilton understands with impressive sophistication for his era. The spacing of repetitions matters enormously. Reviewing material immediately after learning it, and then at gradually increasing intervals, creates memories of a different quality entirely than cramming everything into a single session. The brain, it seems, consolidates memories during the periods between study, not during the study itself. Sleep, rest, and the passage of time are not enemies of learning. They are essential parts of the process. The trained memory works with these rhythms rather than ignoring them. This is one of those insights that sounds almost too simple when you first hear it, but which, when you actually apply it, produces results that feel almost magical. Review something today. Think about it again tomorrow. Return to it after a few days. Then again after a week. What you will find is that each review requires less effort than the last, and the material becomes not just accessible, but fluent. It becomes part of you in a way that forced repetition never quite achieves. Hilton then turns to the question of observation, and this is where the book begins to feel genuinely expansive, because he argues, with great conviction, that the real raw material of memory is not information in the abstract, it is sensory experience, specifically the richness and quality of the sensory experience we allow ourselves to have. Most people, he observes, are remarkably poor observers. They look without seeing, they hear without listening, they move through their days in a kind of perceptual fog, taking in just enough sensory data to navigate their immediate needs, but missing the enormous richness of the world around them. And because their observations are shallow, their memories are shallow. You cannot remember in detail what you never perceived in detail. He invites the reader to conduct a simple experiment. Walk down a street you have walked down 100 times, but this time actually look. Look at the architecture. Look at the people. Look at the colours, the textures, the arrangement of shadows. Listen to the sounds, not just the loud ones, but the quiet ones underneath. Notice how the air smells, what the light is doing, what kind of energy the place has today versus yesterday. Then, later, try to recall what you observed. You will find, almost certainly, that what you observed in that one mindful walk is far more vivid and accessible than everything you have drifted past on all the other walks combined. This is not a trivial exercise. Hilton is making a point that goes very deep. The quality of your memory is directly tied to the quality of your perception. And the quality of your perception is a trainable skill. You can become a better observer. You can learn to see more, hear more, notice more. And as you do, your memory will improve almost automatically, because the material it has to work with becomes richer, more detailed, more alive. He suggests several practical ways to develop observational skill. One is what he calls the exercise of accurate description. After any experience, whether a conversation, a meeting, a walk, a meal, try to describe it in detail, either aloud or in writing. What exactly happened? What was said? What did things look like? What was the sequence of events? This exercise forces you to go back and examine your observation, and in doing so, it deepens the memory trace. Another is the habit of mental reconstruction. At the end of each day, before sleep, take a few minutes to replay the day in your mind, not to judge it or analyze it, but simply to see it again. To walk back through the events, the faces, the conversations, the moments. This quiet act of reconstruction is remarkably powerful. It is as if the mind uses that nighttime review to decide what is worth keeping, and the things you revisit are the things that get filed carefully away. There is a certain kind of person, Hilton notes, who seems to naturally do this. The person who, at a dinner table, can recall exactly who said what, in what tone of voice, with what expression on their face. The person who can describe a room they visited once, years ago, in extraordinary detail. These people are not blessed with unusual biological gifts. They are simply people who were, by habit or by training, intensely present to their experiences. They observed fully. They took the world in rather than sliding over its surface. And every one of us can become that person. That is Hilton's quiet, persistent argument throughout the entire book. Not some of us, all of us, because the mechanisms of memory are universal. The differences between the person with the remarkable memory and the person who forgets everything are differences of habit, of practice, of engagement, not differences of fundamental capacity. Now, somewhere around what we might call the heart of this book, Hilton turns to one of the most practical and immediately applicable sections of his entire framework. He talks about the specific challenge of remembering names and faces and why this particular skill matters so much. He points out, with gentle humour, that the inability to remember names is perhaps the most universally shared memory complaint. Almost everyone struggles with it. Almost everyone has experienced the acute social embarrassment of meeting someone for the second or third time and having absolutely no idea what their name is. And most people, when they examine their failure honestly, realise that the problem was not retention, it was initial registration. They were simply not paying attention when the name was given. The trained approach to names is straightforward but requires practice. When you hear a name, you do several things almost simultaneously. First, you actually listen to it. Not in the background, but in the foreground. You let the sound of it register fully. Second, you use it immediately. You say it back in the natural flow of conversation. You say, "It is wonderful to meet you, Margaret," or "That is a fascinating point, Thomas." Using the name activates it, moves it from passive reception into active production, and that transition alone deepens the trace significantly. Third, you look for something to connect the name to, an image, a rhyme, a person you already know with the same name, a meaning the name might carry. You build a small web of association around it right there in the moment. This takes perhaps 5 or 10 seconds of mental effort. That is all. But those 5 or 10 seconds are the difference between remembering and forgetting. And over time, as you practice this, it becomes automatic. It stops feeling like work and starts feeling like simply what you do when you meet someone. The same principles apply to faces, numbers, dates, and technical information. In each case, the strategy is the same at its core: genuine attention, active association, and appropriately spaced review. The specific techniques vary by type of information, but the underlying logic is always the same because it is drawn from the underlying logic of how memory itself works. There is a story worth telling here about a young salesman named Marcus who read a book very much like this one early in his career, a book that laid out these principles clearly and practically. Marcus had been struggling. He was good at his job in many ways, enthusiastic and knowledgeable, but he kept losing clients to competitors who seemed to have some social quality he lacked. He could never quite put his finger on what it was. After reading about the principles of attention and association, Marcus made one small change. Whenever he met a client, new or returning, he stopped for just a moment before he went in. He thought about what he remembered about that person. Their name, of course, but also their family situation, their business challenges, their personality, a detail from their last conversation. He arrived at every meeting having done this small act of mental preparation, and then, during the meeting, he was fully present, not rehearsing his sales pitch in his head while the client talked. Actually listening, actually noticing. The effect was immediate and lasting. Clients began to comment on how he made them feel. They used words like valued, respected, understood. One client told him directly, "You actually listen. You actually remember. That matters to me more than price." Marcus went on to build an extraordinary career, not because he had some unusual social gift, but because he had trained his attention and his memory to be fully present with people. And those people felt it. They could not explain it, but they felt it. That quality of genuine presence, of truly seeing and hearing another person, is magnetic. It creates trust, and it begins with the decision to pay attention. This is one of the places where Hilton's book transcends the purely technical and touches something almost philosophical. He is not just teaching us how to remember facts. He is teaching us how to be more present, more engaged, more genuinely human in our interactions with the world and with each other. A trained memory, in his vision, is not just a more efficient tool, it is a more alive way of being. We should spend some time now on a section of the book that many readers find unexpectedly fascinating, and that is Hilton's treatment of imagination and its relationship to memory. Because, in popular thinking, memory and imagination are often treated as opposites. Memory is about what was real, imagination is about what is made up. But Hilton sees them as deeply intertwined, almost as two expressions of the same underlying capacity. He argues that the richness of your memory depends significantly on the richness of your mental imagery. The person who thinks in vivid, detailed pictures, who can construct and manipulate mental images with ease, has a natural advantage in memory, because visual memory is among the strongest and most reliable forms of memory available to us. We are, he reminds us, profoundly visual creatures. Our brains devote enormous resources to processing and storing visual information. Harnessing this power intentionally is one of the great strategies of the trained memory. This is the basis of what he calls the method of visual association. When you want to remember something, you create a clear, vivid mental image that encodes the information. The more specific, the more unusual, the more emotionally coloured the image is, the more effectively it works. A strange image is remembered precisely because it is strange. The mind flags the unusual, the unexpected, the slightly absurd, and holds on to it. Hilton gives us a framework for this, but more importantly, he gives us the conceptual understanding of why it works. It works because the mind is naturally drawn to the novel. It is constantly monitoring for things that stand out from the background, things that require special attention, things that represent either opportunity or threat. A bizarre or unexpected image triggers this monitoring system and gets flagged for deeper processing. The result is a stronger, more durable memory trace. He is careful to note, however, that this technique works best as a complement to genuine understanding rather than a substitute for it. You can use vivid imagery to help remember a name, a date, a technical term, a sequence of steps. But the deepest and most durable memories are always rooted in real understanding. The person who truly understands a concept does not need tricks to remember it, because it is woven into their web of knowledge in a way that is naturally self-sustaining. The techniques of visual association and mnemonic imagery are valuable tools for specific challenges, but Hilton never loses sight of the bigger goal, which is the development of a mind that understands deeply, observes fully, and engages genuinely with what it encounters. There is a passage in his thinking, and at this point we are getting near that 10-minute mark in a spoken presentation of these ideas, where we might pause and reflect on just how far we have come. We started with a man who thought his memory was broken. We have now arrived at a place where we understand that memory is a living, dynamic capacity, shaped by attention, fed by association, strengthened by appropriate repetition, enriched by vivid observation, and deepened by genuine understanding. We have seen that every one of these elements is trainable, that every one of them responds to practice and intention. And we have begun to see that the development of memory is not a narrow technical project. It is an expansion of consciousness itself. If this is resonating with you, if you are finding these ideas useful and you want more content like this, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Audiobook Library. It genuinely helps the channel reach more people who are looking for exactly this kind of content. Your support makes it possible to keep bringing these ideas to life, and we are deeply grateful for every single person who is listening. Now let us continue, because there is still so much that Hilton has to offer us. One of the most striking sections of his book deals with what he calls the will to remember, and this phrase deserves some unpacking because it is easy to misunderstand. He does not mean brute willpower in the sense of trying harder, gritting your teeth, pressing your forehead against the wall of your own mind. He means something more subtle and more interesting. He means the conscious, deliberate decision to make memory a priority, to decide, in a real and lasting way, that you are going to engage with your experience rather than drift through it. Most people, Hilton observes, have a passive relationship with their own memory. They hope information will stick. They wonder why it does not. But they never make a conscious, active commitment to the process of remembering. They never bring intention to the encounter between their mind and the world. And without that intention, without that willingness to actually do the small things that make memory work, all the knowledge in the world about how memory functions is useless. The will to remember is the difference between a passive and an active mind, and Hilton argues that this willingness can itself be cultivated. You can choose to bring more intention to your encounters with information. You can choose to pause before moving on, to review before sleeping, to connect before cataloguing. These are choices, small ones but genuinely transformative when made consistently over time. He connects this to a broader philosophy of mental development. He believes, deeply and consistently, that the mind is not fixed, that it is not determined by birth or circumstance, that it is a living capacity that grows in response to use, to challenge, to intention. This is not wishful thinking. It is a principle that modern neuroscience has confirmed and elaborated on in ways Hilton could not have anticipated. The brain, we now know, is neuroplastic. It literally rewires itself in response to experience. The connections that are used grow stronger. The connections that are neglected grow weaker. We are, in a very real biological sense, shaped by what we pay attention to and how we engage with it. Hilton arrives at this conclusion through a different path, through careful observation and psychological reasoning rather than neuroscience, but he arrives at the same place. The mind you have tomorrow is not the same as the mind you have today, and the difference is in how you use it today. This is both humbling and enormously empowering. Humbling because it means we cannot excuse ourselves by pointing to our limitations as if they were permanent fixtures. Empowering because it means that every day is an opportunity, every encounter is a chance to train the mind a little further. Let us now spend some time on a section of the book that deals specifically with professional and practical memory, because Hilton is nothing if not practical. He is deeply interested in how these principles apply in the real world of work, study, and achievement. He makes the case that the person with a trained memory has an advantage in virtually every field of human endeavour, not because they can recite facts faster, but because their ability to retain, connect, and recall information allows them to think more effectively. A well-stocked and well-organised mind can draw on a richer range of material when facing a problem. It can find connections and solutions that a more scattered mind would miss entirely. He gives particular attention to the challenge of studying and learning complex material, which is relevant to anyone who is still in formal education, but also to anyone who is trying to learn a new skill, a new language, a new field. His advice is to study in a way that mimics the natural process of memory formation rather than fighting against it. Begin by getting an overview. Before diving into details, understand the structure of what you are learning. What is the big picture? What are the main categories? What is the relationship between the parts? This overview gives you a framework, a skeleton onto which you can hang the specific details you encounter as you go deeper. Without this skeleton, details float in isolation and are quickly lost. With it, each detail finds its natural place and is held in position by everything around it. Then dive into the details, but never lose track of the big picture. Keep asking, where does this fit? Why does this matter? How does this connect to what I already know? This is not a passive reading strategy. It requires active engagement, but it produces a qualitatively different kind of understanding, one that is durable and flexible rather than brittle and context-dependent. Review, but review intelligently. After a study session, close the material and try to recall what you learned. Not word for word, but in your own words, in your own structure, organized around your own understanding. This act of recall, of actively pulling information back out, rather than just looking at it again, is extraordinarily powerful. It forces the mind to actually retrieve the information, which is precisely the skill you want to develop. And every act of retrieval strengthens the trace, makes the next retrieval easier, makes the memory more robust. Hilton is describing, in the language of his era, what we now call active recall and spaced repetition, techniques that modern educational psychology has confirmed are among the most effective learning strategies available to us. But Hilton understood them intuitively, through observation and reflection, nearly a century before the science caught up. One area where he is especially interesting is his treatment of the connection between physical health and mental performance. He is refreshingly direct about this. The brain is part of the body. The brain is, in fact, a physical organ that runs on blood, oxygen, and nutrition. The quality of your memory is inseparable from the quality of your overall health. Fatigue impairs memory. Poor nutrition impairs memory. Chronic stress impairs memory. Lack of sleep impairs memory, not just temporarily, but cumulatively, in ways that are deeply difficult to reverse. This is not an excuse for those who are genuinely dealing with health challenges beyond their control. It is an observation about the holistic nature of mental capacity. You cannot separate the brain from the body that houses it any more than you can separate the quality of a fire from the quality of the wood that feeds it. Taking care of your body is, among other things, an act of taking care of your mind. He also speaks to the role of relaxation and mental rest. The person who is chronically anxious, chronically rushed, chronically overloaded is a person whose memory will suffer not because their fundamental capacity is diminished, but because the conditions required for proper attention, proper consolidation, and proper retrieval are simply not present. The mind needs quiet. It needs space. It needs the occasional long breath and the occasional long walk. These are not luxuries. They are requirements for a mind that works well. There is a story here that feels worth sharing. A woman named Elena had built a career in the legal profession, and it was a demanding one. She was known for her sharp intellect, her precise reasoning, and her excellent judgment. But as the years passed and the pressure mounted, she began to notice a troubling change. Her memory, always reliable, was becoming patchy. She would lose her train of thought mid-sentence. She would forget things she had known for years. She would walk into her own office and feel momentarily lost. The solution her colleagues suggested was more organization, more systems, more lists, more apps. And she tried all of these things. They helped slightly, but the underlying problem persisted. One summer she took a long vacation, the first real one in many years. No email, no case files, no deadlines, long mornings, evening walks, books read for pleasure, time spent with people she loved. When she returned, something had changed. Her mind felt different, sharper, but also more spacious. The patchiness was gone. She could think in long, uninterrupted lines again. She could hold complex arguments in her head without losing the thread. And it was not because she had learned new techniques. It was because she had given her brain the rest it had been desperately needing. Hilton would have nodded at Elena's story without surprise, because he understood that memory, like all human capacities, cannot be endlessly pressed without maintenance. It needs to be cared for. It needs to be respected. The trained memory is not a machine that you run harder when it falters. It is a living capacity that responds to care, to rest, to nourishment, to joy. Let us turn now to one of the more philosophical dimensions of Hilton's work, because there is a layer here that goes beyond technique and speaks to something like a vision of human life and human possibility. Hilton believes, with quiet but evident conviction, that the cultivation of memory is inseparable from the cultivation of character, that the kind of attention required for a trained memory, the kind of genuine presence, the quality of engagement, the willingness to care about what you are experiencing, these things do not stay neatly contained within the category of memory techniques. They spill over into everything. They change the way you relate to people. They change the way you engage with your work. They change the quality of your inner life. The person who has trained their attention becomes, over time, a different kind of person, a more patient person, a more curious person, a person who is capable of being genuinely interested in the world and in the people in it, rather than merely using the world as a backdrop for their own anxieties and plans. This is a remarkable transformation, and it begins with something as apparently small as deciding to pay attention. There is a word that runs quietly through all of Hilton's thinking, and the word is respect. Not in the social sense, but in the perceptual sense. To pay attention to something is, at a fundamental level, to respect it, to take it seriously, to say, with your mind if not your mouth, that this thing is worth my full presence. And when you extend that quality of attentive respect to the people you meet, to the ideas you encounter, to the experiences that make up your life, something opens up. Something becomes possible that was not possible before. There is a different quality to the memories we carry from moments of genuine presence. They are not just more vivid, they are more meaningful. They carry more of life in them. The meal you truly tasted, the conversation you truly heard, the landscape you truly saw, these are the memories that nourish you in later years. These are the ones that constitute, in the deepest sense, a life that was actually lived rather than merely passed through. And Hilton is suggesting, gently but clearly, that this quality of living, this fullness of presence, can be chosen. It is not a gift given to some and not others. It is a practice. And the practice of training the memory, done with the right spirit, is simultaneously the practice of being more fully alive. Now let us look at some of the specific, practical guidance Hilton offers for different situations, because he is always rooted in the real, and he wants his ideas to actually change how you behave in the world, not just how you think about yourself. For the student facing a body of material to be learned, his advice flows naturally from everything we have already discussed. Begin with an overview, build the skeleton, then flesh it out with detail, always connecting the detail to the structure. Review actively, using recall rather than rereading as your primary tool. Space your reviews over time. Teach the material to someone else, or pretend to, because the act of explanation forces you to understand what you actually know versus what you only think you know. And bring curiosity to it. Find the angle of interest. Find the human story inside the academic content. For the professional who needs to stay on top of a large and constantly changing body of information, the advice is similar, but with particular emphasis on organization. Not the external organization of files and folders and systems, though those have their place, but the internal organization of understanding. The person who truly understands the field they work in does not need to remember every detail, because the details that matter most are naturally connected to a web of understanding that makes them easy to retrieve. The person who has only surface familiarity needs to remember everything because they have no web to support them. This is one of the most liberating insights in the entire book. Deep understanding lightens the burden of memory. The more you truly understand something, the less effort it takes to remember it, because it is held in place by its relationships to everything else you know. The goal of learning is not to pack in as many facts as possible. It is to build a genuine, living understanding that organizes facts naturally and makes them accessible without strain. For the person who wants to improve their memory in social situations, remembering names, recalling details from previous conversations, keeping track of what matters to the people in their life, the guidance is again rooted in attention and association. Be fully present in conversations. Listen not just to the words, but to the person. Be interested, genuinely interested, in what they are telling you. Make a mental note of what matters to them. Take a moment after important conversations to consolidate what you learned and use what you remember. There is nothing more powerful than returning to someone with a detail they shared with you weeks ago, a detail that tells them you were listening, that you valued what they said, that they mattered enough to you to be remembered. This is one of the most profound uses of a trained memory, and it costs almost nothing. Hilton also addresses, with some delicacy, the question of memory in later life. He is aware that many people believe memory inevitably declines with age, and that this belief sometimes functions as a self-fulfilling prophecy. People expect to forget more, so they invest less effort in the practices that support memory, which means they do forget more, which confirms the expectation. He argues against this passivity. He acknowledges that certain aspects of cognitive function change with age, and this was true in his time and has been elaborated on extensively by modern research. But he insists that the core practices of the trained memory, genuine attention, active association, regular review, vivid observation, remain effective across the entire span of life. The mind that has been actively trained is a mind that ages differently from the mind that has been passive. Use it or lose it is not just a cliché. It is a description of how the brain actually works. He cites examples, in the spirit of his era, of remarkable men and women in their later years who retained extraordinary mental acuity, who continued to learn, to create, to engage with the world. And in each case, the quality that distinguished them was not biological luck, though that plays a role, but habitual mental activity, habitual engagement, habitual curiosity. They had kept the fire going, they had kept feeding it, and so it continued to burn. This is an immensely encouraging vision, and it is one that has been broadly validated by modern research. The brain, throughout life, continues to respond to stimulation. It continues to form new connections, to consolidate new learning, to grow in response to challenge and engagement. The window does not close. It may narrow in certain ways, but it does not close. And the person who understands this, who acts on it, who refuses the passive drift into cognitive decline, gives themselves a gift that no external resource can provide. Before we go deeper into the philosophical dimension, let us sit with one more layer of practical wisdom that Hilton offers, because he is not a man who ever lets theory float too far from daily life. He turns his attention, in a section that many readers find particularly eye-opening, to the question of what he calls mental fatigue and its relationship to memory failure. We live in an era, and his era was not so different in this respect, where the demands on human attention are relentless. There are things to read, people to respond to, decisions to make, problems to solve, meetings to attend, and on from the moment of waking to the moment of sleep. And under these conditions, attention, which we have established as the absolute foundation of memory, becomes depleted, not metaphorically depleted, but literally. The neural resources required to sustain focused attention are finite within any given period of waking time. They can be restored by rest, but while depleted, they cannot be commanded back into action by willpower alone. This is something that people in driven, ambitious states of mind often resist. They want to believe that more effort, more discipline, more forcing of the mind will produce better results. And up to a point, that is true. But past a certain threshold of fatigue, more effort produces rapidly diminishing returns. The mind that is exhausted begins to process shallowly. Attention becomes diffuse and unfocused, association becomes sluggish, and memory formation becomes correspondingly poor. You can sit in front of a page of text for hours when your mind is exhausted and retain almost nothing, because the machinery of encoding has shut down. Hilton's prescription here is counterintuitive to anyone raised on the ethic of grinding through. Rest, not just sleep, though sleep is critical and we will return to it, but rest in the sense of genuine mental disengagement during waking hours, periods of quiet, periods of non-directed thought, periods where the mind is not being pressed into any particular task but is allowed to wander freely, to make connections at its own pace, to consolidate what it has recently encountered. Modern research has given us a name for the brain system that activates during these rest periods. It is called the default mode network, and it is now understood to play a crucial role in memory consolidation, creative insight, and the integration of new information with existing knowledge. When you stare out a window for a few minutes, apparently doing nothing, your brain is often doing some of its most important work. It is making connections, embedding recent learning, constructing meaning from experience. You are not wasting time. You are, in a very real biological sense, doing the work of memory. Hilton arrived at this understanding through observation rather than neuroscience, but he arrived at it clearly and articulated it with remarkable precision. The student who studies for 3 hours without interruption retains less than the student who studies for 90 minutes, rests for 20, and then studies for another 90. The professional who works through lunch and through every break returns home with less to show for their effort than they would have achieved with proper spacing. The mind is not a muscle that simply gets stronger the longer you press it. It is a more complex system, one that requires periods of integration and recovery to function at its best. He also makes a distinction that is easy to overlook between the rest that restores and the distraction that depletes. Scrolling through a stream of fragmented information is not rest. Watching something fast-paced and emotionally jarring is not rest. These activities actually tax attentional resources rather than restoring them. Real rest is genuinely quiet, genuinely non-demanding. A walk without a destination, a few minutes of stillness, a brief period of doing absolutely nothing in particular. These seem luxurious and perhaps slightly irresponsible to a certain kind of achiever. But Hilton would argue, and he would be right, that they are among the most productive things that a serious person can do. There is a man in this story, a writer named Ezra, who spent years producing work at an exhausting pace. He was proud of his discipline. He wrote long hours, 7 days a week, rarely pausing, always pressing forward, and for a while it worked. He produced a great deal, but gradually he noticed something troubling. The work was becoming mechanical. The connections he used to make naturally, the unexpected angles, the fresh perspectives, the surprising turns of phrase, were drying up. He was still producing words, but they were not the same quality of words. Something essential had drained away. A colleague suggested something that seemed almost offensive in its simplicity. Take the mornings off, not to relax exactly, but to do nothing in particular. Walk, sit in a park, let the mind do what it wants. Ezra resisted this idea for weeks, convinced that his problem was not enough work rather than too much. But eventually, Out of something close to desperation, he tried it. The results surprised him. In the first week, very little happened. His mind, used to being driven, was restless and uncomfortable with freedom. But in the second week, something loosened. Thoughts began to arise on their own, unexpected and interesting ones. Connections formed that he had been too busy and too tired to notice before. He returned to the desk in the afternoons with an energy and a freshness that he had not felt in years. His work transformed. The quality returned, and with it came something even better than the quality. The joy. The real, native joy of working with ideas, which fatigue had slowly, quietly extinguished. Ezra's story is Hilton's argument made flesh. The mind that is cared for produces better work. The mind that is given space produces richer connections. The mind that is allowed to rest consolidates and integrates and returns to its tasks renewed. This is not a soft idea. It is a hard, practical truth, and anyone who applies it will discover its reality immediately. Now let us turn to another dimension of Hilton's thinking that deserves careful attention, his analysis of what he calls the education of the senses. We touched on this earlier in the context of observation, but it goes deeper than we explored, and it is worth returning to with more detail. Hilton argues that the five senses are not fixed instruments but trainable ones, that the musician who has spent years listening analytically to music hears things that the casual listener cannot, that the painter who has spent years looking at the world with the eye of a painter sees colour, light and form in ways that the untrained eye misses entirely, that the perfumer develops a sensitivity to scent that would seem almost supernatural to someone who has never cultivated that sensory awareness. These are not biological gifts. They are trained capacities, and the principle extends to all the senses in all their applications. For the purpose of memory, this matters enormously, because richer sensory experience creates richer memory. The person who has learned to truly listen hears more, and therefore remembers more of what they hear. The person who has learned to truly look sees more, and carries those images with them in more vivid detail. Every dimension of sensory awareness that you develop is a dimension of memory that you strengthen. He suggests several practical disciplines for developing sensory acuity. For sight, the practice of deliberate, slow, attentive looking, not the quick visual scanning that we typically use to orient ourselves in space, but the deeper looking that takes in texture, colour, relationship and detail. For hearing, the practice of genuine listening, not just to words and their meanings, but to tone, rhythm, pause, emphasis, the music of language and the music of the environment. For touch, the occasional deliberate attention to the physical qualities of things, their weight, their texture, their temperature, their resistance. These small exercises, practiced regularly, gradually expand the richness of perception, and with it the richness of memory. There is something almost meditative in this practice, and Hilton is not unaware of the connection. The traditions of contemplative practice from many cultures have always emphasized the training of attention and the deepening of sensory awareness as paths to a richer inner life. Hilton approaches this from a purely secular and practical direction, but he arrives at something that resonates with those deeper traditions. To be fully in your senses is to be fully in your experience. And to be fully in your experience is to live and remember with maximum richness. He is particularly interesting on the subject of emotional memory, the way that feelings colour and preserve experience. He notes that we do not remember events in a neutral, purely factual way. We remember them with the emotional tone they carried. A day that was joyful is remembered joyfully. A day that was anxious carries a residue of anxiety even in memory. And this is not a flaw in the memory system. It is one of its features, because emotion is information. It tells us how much something mattered, what category of significance it belongs to, whether it represents something to seek or something to avoid. The implication of this for intentional learning is significant. If you want to remember something, bring feeling to it, not artificial or forced feeling, but genuine engagement. Find the angle from which the material is interesting, important, or relevant to your life. Allow yourself to care about it, because the moment something matters to you emotionally, even slightly, it is tagged by the brain for deeper processing and more durable storage. This is why stories are so powerful as vehicles for learning. A well-told story carries emotional content naturally. The reader or listener is drawn in, invested in the outcome, curious about what happens next, moved by the characters and their struggles. And all of this emotional engagement works in the service of memory. The information embedded in a good story is remembered far more reliably than the same information presented as a list of facts. This is why the greatest teachers across history have been storytellers, and it is why Hilton himself, though his book is fundamentally analytical, never strays too far from the concrete and the human. One of the most illuminating passages in his thinking concerns the relationship between memory and confidence, and this is something that many people in the grip of memory anxiety will find both validating and empowering. He observes that people who believe they have bad memories often perform worse on memory tasks than their actual biological capacity would predict. The belief creates a kind of self-fulfilling anxiety. When you are anxious about forgetting, you are not fully present in the moment of experience because part of your attention is occupied by the worry that you will not remember. And so, the very anxiety about memory impairs the attention that is necessary for memory to function well. The solution he proposes is not to simply decide to be confident, which is not really a solution at all. It is to understand what you now understand about how memory works, and to apply the practices that make memory work well. Because as you begin to experience genuine success, as the name you paid attention to is actually there when you need it, as the material you reviewed properly is actually accessible under pressure, confidence begins to grow organically. Not as a decision, but as a consequence of experience. You learn to trust the system because you have seen it work. This is one of the most psychologically sophisticated points in the entire book. Confidence in memory comes from a history of reliable performance, and reliable performance comes from the application of correct principles. The way to stop fearing your memory is to actually train it, to experience its reliability firsthand, and to let that experience reshape your beliefs about what you are capable of. There is also something Hilton says about the role of purpose in memory that deserves to be highlighted. He argues that we remember most reliably the things that matter to us in terms of our goals and values, the things that are connected to what we are trying to achieve, what we care about, what we are working toward. And this has a practical implication. If you want to remember something, connect it, explicitly and consciously, to your purposes. Ask not just what this information is, but why it matters to you. What will you do with it? How does it connect to the life you are trying to build? The answers to these questions create pathways of meaning that make the information far more accessible. This is partly why passionate people tend to have extraordinary memories in the domains of their passion. The obsessive music fan who can recall every album, every lineup, every release date, every influence. The sports enthusiast who carries statistics and histories in their head with effortless fluency. The historian who can navigate centuries of events with the ease of someone walking around their own neighborhood. In each case, the passion creates an environment of constant engagement, constant connection-making, constant review and application, and the memory in that domain flourishes. Hilton's insight is that this passionate engagement need not be reserved only for domains of natural interest. You can, with intention, bring something of that quality of engagement to domains that do not come naturally. You can find the angle of interest, the personal relevance, the human significance. You can create the conditions under which your memory will work as effectively in the domains you need to master as it does in the domains you naturally love. It requires more conscious effort, at least at first, but the effort becomes less over time as genuine interest develops, as competence grows, as the domain begins to yield its own rewards. And here we come to a cycle that Hilton finds deeply encouraging. The more you know about something, the more interesting it becomes. The more interesting it becomes, the more easily you learn and remember more of it. The more you remember, the more you know. The more you know, the richer your associations become. And around the cycle goes, each revolution deepening your engagement and your capacity. Knowledge feeds curiosity. Curiosity feeds knowledge. Understanding feeds memory. Memory feeds understanding. This is how mastery actually develops. Not through force, but through cultivated engagement that feeds itself. The person who becomes genuinely knowledgeable in any field will tell you that at some point the effort of learning in that field changed its character. It stopped feeling like effort and started feeling like exploration. The information stopped feeling like a burden to carry and started feeling like a landscape to inhabit. That transformation is the result of the cycle Hilton describes, the positive feedback loop of knowledge, curiosity, memory, and more knowledge, and it is available in any field to any person who is willing to begin. This is perhaps the most genuinely motivating thing that Hilton says in the entire book, and he says it in various ways across many chapters. The beginning is the hardest part. In the early stages of learning anything, when associations are few and understanding is shallow, memory is harder and the material is less intrinsically interesting. This is the stage where most people give up, convinced that the field is simply not for them, that they do not have the right kind of mind for it. But if they could push through that early stage, if they could invest enough effort to reach the point where a genuine web of understanding begins to form, everything changes. The material becomes interesting. Memory becomes easier. Learning becomes self-reinforcing. The trained memory is, therefore, among other things, a patient memory. A memory that understands the arc of learning, that does not panic in the early stages of difficulty, but trusts the process, that recognizes the initial resistance as the normal experience of a mind encountering genuinely new territory rather than a signal that the territory is inaccessible. Now let us come to one of the most moving and personally significant sections of Hilton's work, his treatment of memory and the sense of self, because he believes, and states this with a conviction that feels almost poetic in its expression, that we are, in a very real sense, our memories, that the continuity of the self across time is the continuity of memory, that the person who loses their memories loses, in some important sense, themselves, and that the person who enriches their memory, who cultivates it carefully and with intention, is enriching their very sense of being alive. There is something almost sacred in Hilton's vision about the act of remembering well. It is not just an intellectual achievement, it is a way of honouring the life you have lived, of keeping faith with your own experience, of saying that what happened to you mattered, that the people who shaped you mattered, that the things you learned and felt and saw and thought were worth preserving. This is perhaps not what most people expect from a book that presents itself as a guide to practical memory improvement, but it is there, running through the entire work like a vein of gold through ordinary rock. Hilton is not just teaching us how to be more efficient, he is inviting us to be more human. There is a kind of grief in forgetting, and Hilton acknowledges this gently. The moments we lose, the faces we cannot quite reconstruct, the conversations that have dissolved into general impression, these represent real losses. Not catastrophic ones, for the most part, but real ones. And the corollary to this acknowledgement is a kind of gratitude for the memories we do carry, the faces that remain vivid, the voices we can still hear, the moments that come back to us fully formed, decades later, as alive as they were when they happened. This is what a trained memory over a lifetime accumulates, a treasury of experience, a richness of inner life that no external possession can match, and it is available to anyone who chooses to pursue it. As we move toward the conclusion of our exploration of this remarkable book, it is worth gathering the central threads together and seeing them as a whole. Because there is a coherence here, a unity of vision that is easy to miss if you focus only on the individual techniques. Warren Hilton's The Trained Memory is, at its heart, a book about engagement, about the quality of your relationship with your own experience, about the choice, made moment by moment and day by day, to be present rather than absent, to pay attention rather than drift, to connect and understand rather than merely accumulate. The techniques he offers, the methods of association, the practices of observation, the strategies for review and recall, these are all expressions of a single underlying principle. That memory is not a passive receiving station, but an active participant in the shaping of experience. That the quality of your memory is a reflection of the quality of your engagement with life, and that both can be deliberately, intentionally, joyfully improved. The person who takes these ideas seriously and applies them consistently will not just remember more. They will notice more. They will understand more. They will connect more deeply with the people and the ideas that matter to them. They will be more present at their own life, more alive to its richness, more capable of the kind of full, engaged, meaningful experience that is, in the end, what we are all looking for. There is a beautiful irony in the title of this book. The trained memory suggests discipline, effort, technique, and yes, all of those things are present. But the deeper message, the one that persists long after the specific techniques have been absorbed and applied, is one of liberation, the liberation that comes from understanding your own mind, from working with it rather than against it, from discovering that the capacity you thought was limited or broken or simply not available to you was there all along, waiting to be called forth. Daniel, the man we met at the beginning, the one who found his grandfather's copy of a book very much like this one, went on to do something remarkable. He became a teacher, and he was the kind of teacher that students remember for the rest of their lives, not because he was entertaining or particularly charismatic, though he had his moments, but because he was genuinely present with his students. He remembered them, he noticed them, he connected with them as individuals rather than as a collective audience, and his students, in response, brought their full attention to his class. Because when someone truly sees you, truly listens to you, truly engages with you, you cannot help but rise to meet them. That is the ultimate expression of a trained memory, and perhaps of a trained life, the capacity to be fully present, to bring your whole self, your whole attention, your whole genuine interest to whatever and whoever is before you, to give the gift of your presence fully and without reservation, and to receive in return a life that feels, as all truly lived lives do, like something worth remembering. Warren Hilton wrote his book over a century ago. The world he lived in was different from ours in countless ways, but the mind he wrote about is the same mind you carry inside your skull right now. The same mechanisms, the same tendencies, the same remarkable, underused, endlessly trainable capacity. His insights did not age because they were rooted in the permanent architecture of human consciousness. And they are as applicable to your life today as they were to his readers all those decades ago. You have the tools now, not just the techniques, but the understanding. Not just the methods, but the vision. You understand that attention is the foundation of everything. That association is the structure that holds memories in place. That repetition, done with intelligence and proper spacing, is what transforms memory from temporary to permanent. That observation, rich and full and engaged, is the raw material from which powerful memories are made. That rest and health and care for yourself are not separate from the project of mental development, but integral to it. That the will to remember is a choice that can be made and remade moment to moment in every encounter with the world. And you understand, perhaps most importantly, that this whole project, the training of memory, the cultivation of attention, the development of a richer and more present engagement with experience, is not a burden. It is a gift you give yourself, a gift that compounds over time, that enriches every dimension of life, that makes you more capable in your work, more connected in your relationships, more alive to the beauty and complexity of the world you live in. We should also spend time with Hilton's treatment of a subject he handles with particular delicacy, the role of language in memory. He argues that language is not just a tool for communicating memories, it is one of the primary structures through which memories are formed and stored. When we put an experience into words, when we narrate it to ourselves or to others, we do something significant. We organize it, we give it shape, we connect it to the broader narrative of our life and our understanding, and in doing so, we make it more memorable. This is why journaling has such a powerful effect on memory and on psychological well-being more broadly. It is not simply the act of writing things down so they are stored externally. It is the act of translating experience into language which deepens the internal trace. The process of finding words for what happened, for what you felt, for what it meant, is itself a process of consolidation. You are doing, deliberately and consciously, what the brain does naturally during sleep and rest, organizing and deepening the memory of experience. Hilton encourages the reader to cultivate the habit of verbal expression, not as a performance for others, but as a tool for themselves. Talk about what you are learning. Explain it to someone. Write about it. Put it into your own words rather than someone else's. Every act of verbal expression is an act of memory consolidation. Every time you find language for an experience, you strengthen the trace and make it more accessible. He is also interesting on the subject of reading and how to read in a way that actually builds memory rather than creating the illusion of it. Most people, when they read, experience a sensation of understanding as they move through the text, a sense that the ideas are registering, that they are following the argument. But when they close the book, often very little of that understanding is actually available to them. The sensation of comprehension in the moment does not translate to durable memory because they were reading passively, letting the words wash over them rather than actively engaging with the ideas. Hilton advocates for a very different approach. Read with a question in mind. Read with the intention of finding something specific. Read actively, pausing regularly to summarize what you have just read in your own words, to ask what you think about it, to connect it to something you already know. These active practices transform reading from a passive reception of information into a genuine engagement with ideas, and the result is a dramatically different quality of retention. He also makes a point that seems almost obvious once stated, but is consistently overlooked in practice. The single best predictor of whether you will remember something you have read is whether you think about it after you have read it. Not immediately, necessarily, though that helps, but at any point, in any context, turning the ideas over in your mind, applying them to situations you encounter, discussing them with other people, revisiting them when something relevant happens. These acts of continued engagement are what move information from fragile short-term availability into durable long-term storage. This is why some books feel like they change you and others feel like they disappear. The books that change you are the ones you carry with you, the ones whose ideas you apply, argue with, think about in the shower, bring into conversations. The books that disappear are the ones you closed and forgot, not because they were less good necessarily, but because you gave them nothing after the initial reading. You gave them no life beyond the page. And this, in a sense, is the meta-lesson of Hilton's entire book. The trained memory is an engaged mind, a mind that does not simply receive, but actively works with what it receives, that connects, applies, reviews, questions, and returns. The techniques are real and the techniques are useful, but they are all in service of a deeper practice, the practice of genuine mental engagement with the world. Hilton spends a particularly interesting chapter on what might be called the architecture of a study session, and though his examples come from the formal academic context he knew, the principles are entirely universal. He believes that the way you begin a learning session matters enormously. The mind, like a sophisticated instrument, needs to be tuned before it performs at its best. Diving into complex material without preparation is like asking a cold engine to perform at full power immediately. You may get some output, but you will get far less than you would if you had taken a few moments to warm up properly. His recommendation is to begin each learning session with a brief review of what you already know about the subject, not to repeat everything you have ever learned, but to activate the existing web of knowledge and bring it to a state of readiness. When your existing knowledge is active in your mind, new information finds more connections, integrates more smoothly, and is remembered more reliably. You are preparing the soil before planting. Then he says to establish a clear intention for the session. What specifically do you want to understand by the time you finish? What questions do you want to answer? What gaps in your knowledge do you want to fill? Having a clear intention transforms the session from an unfocused absorption of information into a purposeful search, and purposeful search is a dramatically more effective mode for memory formation. Throughout the session, he recommends what he calls active noting, which is not the same as passive transcription. Active noting is the practice of putting the most important ideas into your own words, often with brief examples or illustrations as you go. This forces engagement, forces comprehension rather than merely the appearance of it, and creates a set of notes that are far more valuable as a review tool later because they represent your actual understanding rather than someone else's words. At the end of the session, he recommends a brief consolidation. Close the material. Ask yourself, what were the most important ideas? What surprised you? What connected to something you already knew? What do you still not understand? This closing review takes only a few minutes, but it does more for long-term retention than any amount of passive rereading. This entire framework, which Hilton lays out with characteristic care and clarity, is one of the most practical contributions of his book, because it is immediately applicable. You can change the way you approach your next learning session today. You can warm up, set an intention, note actively, and close with a consolidation. And if you do, you will remember more of what you studied, not a little more, significantly more. The difference between this approach and the passive, unfocused, hope-for-the-best approach that most people use is not subtle. It is dramatic. There is something else Hilton addresses that connects the individual practice of memory training to the broader question of what kind of person you want to become. He talks about the cumulative effect of a life lived with trained attention and trained memory, not just in terms of the information you carry, though that is substantial, but in terms of the quality of your inner life, the texture of your experience. The person who has spent years practicing genuine attention carries with them, as a kind of permanent enrichment, an inner world that is alive with detail, connection, and meaning. They remember not just facts, but experiences, not just what happened, but how it felt, what it looked like, what it meant. They have, in a sense, a richer inner autobiography than the person who has drifted through the same number of years without the same quality of engagement. This inner richness has practical benefits, of course. The person with a well-stocked and well-organized memory is a better thinker, a better problem solver, a better communicator. But it also has benefits that are harder to quantify but deeply significant. It makes old age richer. It makes solitude more comfortable. It makes the ordinary moments of life feel less ordinary, because they are received with more presence and retained with more care. There is something worth acknowledging here, something that Hilton hints at without fully developing, about the relationship between memory and gratitude. The person who remembers well tends to be a more grateful person, not because gratitude is a technique of memory, but because the practice of attention and presence that underlies a trained memory also makes the good things of life more visible and more vivid. You notice beauty when you are paying attention. You notice kindness. You notice the small, unremarkable moments of connection and pleasure that constitute so much of what makes a life good. And when you notice these things, and when you remember them, they accumulate into a sense of abundance, a felt understanding that your life contains more good than you might otherwise have recognized. This is, in the end, one of the deepest and most quietly radical claims in Warren Hilton's work, that the training of memory is not just a practical skill, but a way of relating to life. A way that opens rather than closes, that accumulates rather than depletes, that builds rather than erodes. That the person who develops their memory is not just becoming more efficient. They are becoming more alive to the richness of existence, more capable of the kind of full, conscious, meaningful life that is the aspiration of every thoughtful person. There is one more thread to pull before we bring this all together, and it concerns the question of forgetting, because Hilton does not ignore forgetting. He does not pretend that with the right practices, forgetting can be eliminated. He understands, and he is honest about this, that forgetting is a natural and in many ways necessary function of the mind. We cannot carry everything. We should not try. The mind that forgot nothing would be as impaired as the mind that forgot everything, because it would be overwhelmed by the sheer weight of undifferentiated experience, unable to focus, unable to prioritize, unable to think clearly. Forgetting is the mind's way of housekeeping, of clearing out the information that is no longer relevant or useful to make room for what is. And this happens continuously, at every level of the memory system, from the fading of sensory impressions within seconds to the gradual loss of detail from memories that are not regularly revisited over years and decades. It is not a malfunction, it is a feature. What the trained memory does is not eliminate forgetting, but direct it. The things you attend to, associate richly, and review appropriately are protected from forgetting. The things you let slide through without engagement are, correctly and efficiently, allowed to fade. The trained memory is one that has learned, consciously and intentionally, which things are worth the investment of proper encoding and which things can be safely released. This requires a certain wisdom about what matters, a certain clarity about your priorities, a certain willingness to be deliberate about where your attentional resources go. And this is itself a form of self-knowledge, knowing what you need to remember and what you can safely let go, knowing what is worth the investment of full presence and what can be received with half an eye and allowed to dissolve. Hilton does not spend as much time on this dimension as he might, but it is there in the background of everything he says. The trained memory is not just more powerful than the untrained one. It is also wiser. It has better judgment about what deserves its resources, and that judgment develops naturally as the practices deepen and as you learn, through experience, what kinds of things pay dividends when properly remembered and what kinds of things cost nothing when forgotten. So here we are, after this long and rich journey through the ideas of a man who thought more carefully and more compassionately about the human mind than almost anyone of his era. And perhaps the best way to close is to return to where we began, to the simple, startling, transformative premise with which Warren Hilton opens his work. Your memory is not broken. It was never broken. It was just never properly trained. And now you have something that Daniel did not have when he first opened that worn old book, a map. A map of the territory of your own mind. You understand, in a way that is no longer abstract or theoretical, how attention forms the initial trace, how association builds the web that holds that trace in place, how appropriately spaced review transforms fragile short-term impressions into durable long-term knowledge, how the richness of your sensory engagement determines the richness of what you can later recall, how rest and recovery are not luxuries but essential components of a memory system that works, how the will to remember is not brute force but conscious, patient, joyful engagement. You understand that the greatest memories are not the result of effort in the conventional sense. They are the result of presence, of being genuinely, fully, wholeheartedly here for what is happening, and that this quality of presence is not reserved for special moments. It can be brought to any moment. It can become, through practice, the default way you move through your life, rather than a rare and fortunate exception. Consider for a moment what it would mean to live this way, consistently and deliberately, for a year, to bring genuine attention to your conversations, your work, your reading, your relationships, to make the small effort of association and review that transforms experience from something that passes through you into something that stays with you and builds, to sleep with the knowledge that your brain is doing its essential consolidation work, that the things you engaged with today are being woven into the fabric of who you are, to wake with a mind that feels, day by day, a little cleaner, a little richer, a little more capable of the things you want it to do. This is not a fantasy. This is the natural result of applying what Hilton teaches, not in some dramatic, all-at-once transformation, but in the steady, compounding way that real growth always happens. One conversation fully attended to, one piece of material properly reviewed, one habit of observation gradually deepened. These small investments, made consistently, produce a return that exceeds anything that effort alone could generate. And there is a quality to the person who has done this work for years that is immediately recognizable, even if it is hard to name. They are present, they are engaged. They make you feel, when you talk to them, that you are the most interesting person in the room, not because they are performing interest, but because they have trained themselves to actually be interested. They remember things, not just facts and dates, but the things that matter to you, the things you said in passing months ago, the concerns you expressed, the dreams you mentioned. And being remembered in that way, being truly seen and held in another person's attention, is one of the most profound human gifts there is. The trained memory, lived out over years, becomes a kind of character, a way of being in the world that is marked by attentiveness, by richness of inner life, by genuine connection with other people, by the capacity to think deeply and draw on a wide range of experience and knowledge. It is, in the end, not just a cognitive achievement, it is a human one. Warren Hilton knew this. He wrote his book not simply to help people pass exams or remember their grocery lists, though he would have been happy if it helped with those things too. He wrote it because he believed that human beings were capable of far more than they typically demanded of themselves, that the mind, given proper care and proper training, could be a vehicle for a richer, more meaningful, more fully human life. And he wanted, with genuine generosity of spirit, to share the understanding that would make that possible. That understanding is now yours. Use it wisely, use it joyfully, use it consistently. And in doing so, give yourself the memory and the life that you were always capable of having. Listen with both ears. Notice the person in front of you. Let their name land. Let their words matter. Return home tonight and take 5 minutes to walk back through the day in your mind. What happened? What did you notice? What do you want to remember? These are small practices, but they are the beginning of something large. And every day, every week, every month that you practice, you will find that your memory becomes a little more responsive, a little more reliable, a little more alive. You will find that you are carrying more of your life with you, in richer detail, with deeper meaning. You will find that the world, observed more fully and remembered more vividly, is a more interesting and more beautiful place than you had previously noticed. This is Hilton's promise, and it is one he makes with confidence, not because he is offering something magical, but because he is describing something real. Something that has been demonstrated by countless people, in countless contexts, across centuries of human experience. The trained memory is not a fantasy. It is a fact. It is available to you right now, in this very moment, with the mind you already have. The journey toward it begins with the simple decision to engage. Not to try harder in the old way, not to beat yourself up for the forgetting that has come before, but to begin fresh, with understanding and with intention. To look at your mind not as a faulty tool that has let you down, but as a remarkable instrument that has simply been waiting for you to learn how to play it. And once you begin to learn, once you begin to apply even a fraction of what Hilton teaches, you will discover something that surprises almost everyone who goes on this journey. It is not hard. It does not feel like discipline or deprivation. It feels, increasingly and then permanently, like freedom, the freedom of a mind that works with you rather than against you, the freedom of knowing that the things you need to know will be there when you need them, the freedom of being able to be fully present in your own life, to actually inhabit your experience rather than watching it slide past. That freedom is worth more than almost anything else you could cultivate, and it is yours through the ideas that Warren Hilton laid out with such care and intelligence all those years ago, ideas that have lost none of their power, none of their relevance, none of their capacity to change a life. So go engage with this book, if you have not already read it, with the ideas we have explored here together, with the life you are living, which is richer and more worth remembering than you may have fully realized until this moment. And we want to say, with real warmth and genuine gratitude, thank you for spending this time with us. Thank you for the quality of attention you brought to this entire journey. Your time is precious, and the fact that you have chosen to spend part of it exploring these ideas, sitting with them, turning them over, says something genuinely good about who you are and what you are building in yourself. Not everyone would do this. Not everyone chooses to invest in their own mind this way. You did, and that choice matters. If this video made you think, or shifted something, even slightly, in the way you understand your own memory and your own mind, please consider liking it and subscribing to Audiobook Library. It helps the channel grow and reach more people who are looking for exactly this kind of content. Every subscription, every like, every comment tells us that this work matters and that it is worth continuing. This channel is a community of people who believe that understanding the mind, training it, developing it with care and intention is one of the most worthwhile investments a person can make. We are glad you are part of it. Also, we warmly invite you to explore our other videos on this channel. We have a growing library of summaries and in-depth explorations of some of the most important books ever written on psychology, self-development, memory, focus, habits, and human potential. Each one has been prepared with the same care and the same intention as this one, to give you not just information, but genuine understanding, not just facts, but a way of seeing yourself and your possibilities that you can carry into your life and actually use. Please check out our video library and see what else is waiting for you there. You might find your next great idea, your next transformative insight, your next unforgettable read. Take good care of your mind. It is the most remarkable thing you own, and it deserves every bit of care and attention you are now prepared to give it.